All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into the House of Lords.
It's a fascinating institution.
It really is, and it's one that I think a lot of people maybe have heard of, obviously,
Yeah.
but don't really know much about.
Yes?
So, when you say to people, oh, the House of Lords, they kind of go, oh, yeah, okay.
Right.
But we're going to get into all of the nitty-gritty today.
Yeah.
We're going to really kind of unpack this.
And
I've got a ton of books here
as do I.
and articles and all sorts of
A
things.
lot of material to unpack.
Yeah. So where do we even begin with this? I mean, obviously, it's one of the two, parts of the UK Parliament.
It is. It's the upper house.
The upper house.
The House of Lords, and it has a really long and complicated history.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, how far back are we talking? I mean, this is centuries.
Centuries old.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about something that's been around for about 1,000 years.
1,000 years.
Yeah, in some form or another.
So it's not going to be a quick deep dive then.
Well, we'll try and condense it.
Okay.
We got to start somewhere around the 11th century
Okay.
with the Norman Conquest.
Right.
That's where we see the beginnings of what will eventually evolve into the House of Lords.
So it wasn't always called the House of Lords.
No, not originally. It began as a kind of great council advising the monarch.
Right. So I'm picturing a bunch of guys in a room
Pretty much.
drinking ale and, stroking their beards and deciding, what's what.
Something like that.
Okay.
It was a much smaller, more informal gathering back then, but it was the seed.
From which the House of Lords would eventually grow.
So how did we get from this kind of informal gathering
Right.
to what we now know as the House of Lords?
Well, it was a gradual process of evolution.
Right.
It's not like someone woke up one day and said, let's invent the House of Lords.
Okay.
It really emerged over time as the balance of power shifted between the monarchy and the nobility.
So when we talk about the House of Lords, we're talking about the nobility.
Originally, yes. In the beginning, it was primarily made up of barons and bishops, men who held land and power.
So did they all get along, these barons and bishops? I mean, were they all on the same page, or?
I doubt it very much.
Yeah.
Where there's power, there's always going to be some level of disagreement or rivalry.
Yeah, and back then, I imagine those disagreements could get quite heated.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Remember, these weren't just political positions. They were tied to vast wealth land ownership titles. It was high-stakes stuff.
So when did this idea of an upper house and a lower house come about? Because you've got the House of Lords, but you've also got the House of Commons.
You're right. It wasn't always a two-house system.
Okay.
The House of Commons, as we know it today, emerged a bit later.
Right.
It's around the 13th century that we start to see this clear distinction between the two.
So what was happening in the 13th century that led to that?
Well, you have a number of factors at play. The emergence of a merchant class, the growth of towns and cities.
So it's not just landowners anymore.
Exactly. New groups are gaining wealth and influence, and they want a say in how the country is run.
Makes sense.
The monarchy at the time also saw the potential benefits of having another body to counterbalance the power of the nobility.
So the House of Commons was essentially a way to keep the lords in check.
To some extent, yes. It was all about finding a balance of power.
Right.
Which, as we know, is never a simple thing.
And I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
Oh, not at all. The House of Lords and the House of Commons have had a rather tumultuous relationship over the centuries.
I can imagine.
Periods of cooperation and periods of intense rivalry. And let's just say they haven't always seen eye to eye on how the country should be run.
Well, now I'm really interested to dive into some of those more dramatic moments. But first, I think we need a quick break. We'll be right back to trace the evolution of the House of Lords through those turbulent times. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so we're back and ready to delve back into the dramatic history of the House of Lords.
And believe me, it's been a roller coaster ride.
I bet. Where do we pick up?
Well, we left off with the emergence of the House of Commons.
Right around the 13th century.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really interesting because you have these two houses vying for power and influence.
A classic power struggle?
You could say that.
Yeah.
And it comes to a head in the 17th century.
Oh, boy. The 17th century, that's when England had its little revolution thing, right?
Exactly. The English Civil War.
Right. And what happens to our good old House of Lords during all of this?
Well, they basically got caught in the crossfire. Remember, they were seen as closely aligned with the monarchy.
Yeah, and the monarchy wasn't exactly popular at that moment.
To say the least.
Yeah.
And so in 1649, the House of Lords is abolished.
Abolished, just like that.
Well, not entirely just like that. There was a lot leading up to it. But yeah, they were effectively disbanded, deemed useless and dangerous.
Wow, that's harsh. I guess those guys really knew how to hold a grudge.
Well, it's a turbulent time. But here's the interesting thing. The House of Lords, it's like that friend who always seems to bounce back.
They always land on their feet.
Exactly. When the monarchy is restored in 1660, guess who comes back with it?
The House of Lords, of course.
You got it. They return as if nothing had happened, although their power had definitely been clipped somewhat.
Okay, so they're back, but they're not as powerful as they once were.
Right. The House of Commons has started to gain more influence, and this trend continues into the 19th century.
This is where we get to the Reform Act of 1832, right? I read a bit about that.
A pivotal moment in British history. The Reform Act was all about making Parliament more representative.
More democratic, you could say.
Precisely. And as you can imagine, the House of Lords, well, they weren't exactly thrilled with the idea.
Because it meant less power for them.
Exactly. They weren't keen on giving up their privileged position. There was some intense debates and even a threat by the king to create a whole bunch of new lords who supported the Reform Act just to get it passed.
He was going to stack the deck.
Pretty much. It was a bold power play, and it worked. The lords backed down, and the Reform Act became law.
Wow. So even though they were supposed to be this powerful upper house, they still had to answer to someone.
Always.
Mm.
It's a constant dance of power and influence. But the Reform Act was just the beginning of a long process of change for the House of Lords.
So what other big changes happened?
Well, one of the most significant was the House of Lords Act of 1999.
What did that one do?
This act dramatically reduced the number of hereditary peers in the House of Lords.
Hereditary peers meaning like they inherited their position.
Exactly. It had been a point of contention for centuries, this idea that you could inherit a seat in government.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very democratic.
Right. And so the 1999 Act removed hundreds of these hereditary peers, leaving only 92.
92 out of how many?
Well, before the Act, there were over 700 hereditary peers.
Wow. So it was a pretty big shakeup.
It changed the face of the House of Lords significantly.
So if it's not mostly hereditary peers anymore, who's actually in the House of Lords these days?
That's a great question, and it leads us right into the heart of how the House of Lords functions in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's get into it then. Who are these people in the House of Lords today, and what are they actually doing?
Well, the majority are what's called life peers.
Life peers. What's that all about?
So these are people who are appointed to the House of Lords for life.
For life?
Yeah, as opposed to hereditary peers who inherited their positions.
Right. Okay, so you're appointed for life, and who does the appointing?
That would be the Prime Minister.
Yeah, Prime Minister. So it's a bit like, well, I'm trying not to make it sound like some sort of, Game of Thrones situation, but
I understand the comparison.
it's a lot of power for one person to have, right?
You could say that. And it's definitely one of the criticisms that's often leveled at the House of Lords.
Because it could be seen as a way to reward friends or allies or whatever.
Exactly. Critics argue that it lacks transparency and accountability.
Okay, so let's say you're a life peer appointed by the Prime Minister. What do you actually do all day?
Well, their main role is to scrutinize legislation that's passed by the House of Commons.
Okay, so they're like a second set of eyes on new laws.
Precisely. They can propose amendments, send bills back to the Commons for further debate.
So they can't just veto a law outright.
Not anymore. They used to have more power, but that's been significantly reduced over the years.
So they're like advisors with a lot of experience.
In a way, yes. But they still wield considerable influence. Their opinions and expertise are taken very seriously.
Okay, so if their main job is to scrutinize legislation, what else do they do?
They also play a key role in holding the government to account.
How so?
They can question government ministers' debate, government policy, launch inquiries into matters of public importance.
So it's kind of like a public forum for debating the big issues.
You could say that. It's a chance for a wider range of voices to be heard.
Okay, that makes sense. But we were talking about criticisms a minute ago. What are some of the other big ones?
Well, aside from the appointment process, another major criticism is the lack of diversity.
In what sense?
In terms of gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, you name it. The House of Lords is still seen as being very much out of touch with modern British society.
Yeah, I can see how that would be an issue, especially for a body that's supposed to represent the interests of the entire country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's something that's been debated for years. And there have been some attempts to address it, but progress has been slow.
And I imagine there are also people who question the cost of the House of Lords.
Oh, absolutely. It's not exactly a small operation with hundreds of members and a hefty budget.
So what's the future hold for the House of Lords? Do you think we'll see any major reforms anytime soon?
That's the million-dollar question. There are always calls for reform, of course, but whether those calls will be heeded is another matter entirely.
It's one of those things that people love to debate, I guess.
It certainly is,
Yeah.
and it's a debate that's likely to continue for many years to come.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the long and often turbulent history of the House of Lords, from its origins as a small council of advisors to the powerful yet often criticized institution it is today. We've delved into its role in British government, examined the arguments for and against its continued existence, and pondered its future in the 21st century. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey through time and politics. Until next time.